I did catch up with Ted Cruz, and we spent a lot of time talking about China and the NBA, which we'll get into a little bit. But we also talked about Boeing because he's holding hearings on that company next week. We talked about impeachment, and then we talked about the big tech giants. So here's part of that conversation. Take a listen.
Well, I'm very glad we're going to be hearing from Boeing's CEO. I think it's important for Boeing to lay out and reassure the public, number one, what happened to put the 737 MAX out in the air without the safety protections that were needed. I mean, we've seen in 6 months 2 tragic accidents, both of which appear preventable. 346 lives were lost, and I think it is critical that the flying public have confidence in the safety and security of our planes. I chair the Aviation and Space Subcommittee in the Senate Commerce Committee, and Texas is home to tens of thousands of aviation jobs. We depend on aviation for commerce, for transportation. It's vital to Texas and to the whole country. If the American public isn't confident of the safety of planes, that does enormous damage. And if you look at the 737 MAX, what we know is that they put in a new software system, an MCAS system, that adjusted the nose of the plane downwards when the angle of attack got too steep. And at least one of them, we think what happened was a bird strike sheared off the angle of attack sensor so that it read that it was basically pointed up too high, and so it began shifting the nose down. Now, unfortunately, the pilot training didn't explain any of that to the pilots. Not only that, but it used to be that when you pulled back the yoke, it would disengage the stabilization. On the new 737 MAX, it doesn't disengage. It doesn't disengage that stabilization, and they didn't tell the pilots of that change. That is highly dismaying. I think that this hearing next week, we're going to see a lot of questions about why did this happen? What broke down in the regulatory process? Was the FAA too cozy with Boeing? Was there industry capture? And what can be done to make sure these planes are safe, to make sure that the flying public, when you and your family go on vacation, when you get on a plane, that you know your family is going to be safe?
Is it possible that Muhlenberg should have to step down?
Look, that ultimately is a decision for Boeing's board and for their shareholders. But I do think, we saw just in the last few days internal texts and emails at Boeing suggesting very real concern among Boeing employees that safety was not being made the priority it should be. That is an enormous problem in an aviation company. Right. And look, to be clear, flying is still the safest way of traveling. You're safer in an airplane than you are driving your car to the airport. But we need to make sure the flying public has that confidence going forward. And so I hope Boeing makes real steps to reassure the public, number one, what happened looking backwards, but number two, to give the public confidence going forward that safety will be the top priority.
A few other topics I want to touch on. Mark Zuckerberg is testifying here in Washington today. You've been critical of the big tech companies in terms of suppressing free speech,
yes,
how you characterize it. Have you seen any progress? Are you satisfied there?
Well, look, I will say Facebook, I was encouraged. Zuckerberg recently gave a speech
at
Georgetown defending free speech. That was a positive development. I was encouraged to see him expressing those sentiments. I am very concerned about big tech and their censorship of political speech online, their censorship of political discourse. I think Zuckerberg's speech was a positive step forward. I still think there are a lot of big concerns in big tech. If you look at Google worries me immensely. I chair the Constitution Subcommittee in the Senate Judiciary, and we heard testimony from Dr. Robert Epstein that Google in 2016, through manipulated search outcomes, shifted more than 2.4 million votes to support Hillary Clinton and the Democrats through manipulated search outcomes. I think big tech censorship and political manipulation is an enormous threat to our democratic process.
Really shifted 2.4 million votes? You're convinced of that?
It was stunning testimony. And Dr. Epstein, by the way, he's not a Republican. He's not a conservative. He's an academic. He was the former editor of Psychology Today. And what he conducted was empirical research where he had people who were engaged in Google searches and seeing what the outcomes were. And what Dr. Epstein testified, he said he personally is a Democrat. He's liberal. He voted for Hillary Clinton. He wanted Hillary Clinton to win, and he publicly supported her. But he also doesn't believe big tech should be manipulating our election results. And so his testimony, I think, was enormously troubling. And I'll tell you the aftermath of it. So after his testimony, Hillary Clinton blasted him, which Dr. Epstein has since told me he was really startled. As I said, he was a Hillary Clinton supporter, and she just unloaded on him and said, well, his research is debunked and discredited. And I will say, much to their discredit, an awful lot of media outlets simply repeated her baseless accusation that his research has been debunked. It hadn't been debunked. It's careful empirical research by an academic, right. And it poses a real threat to our democratic process.
Speaking of meddling in elections, you've said that it's absolutely the case that foreign governments should not be meddling in our elections, China, Ukraine, and Russia, and yet at the same time you've called the investigation into meddling by Ukraine and Russia a witch hunt. So can you square those things for me?
Look, what is happening in the House right now is not about facts. It's not about what happens. Unfortunately, an awful lot of congressional Democrats from Election Day in 2016 have wanted to impeach the president. They hate the president, and they want to impeach him. And, you know, it reminds me of Alice in Wonderland. Verdict first, trial later. We heard for months and months and months, Russia, Russia, Russia. It was all about Russia. The Mueller report came out, and the allegations that had been made, they weren't true. So now it's shifted to Ukraine. We're hearing lots and lots of Ukraine, but it'll shift to something else because the Democrats' objective, it's not based on facts. It's not based on what happened. They simply they're mad at the American people for electing President Trump. They want to undo a democratic election. If you disagree with someone politically, there's an avenue to do something about that. You beat them at the ballot box. You don't try to throw them out of office. And I think what we're seeing in the House right now is a partisan circus.
I want to talk to you about China a little bit. You just came back from a trip to Asia, and you also recently wrote an op-ed in USA Today. You've been critical of the Chinese government. Recently, we've just heard, though, that in Hong Kong, they have removed the bill that would require the government to extradite citizens to mainland China. Do you think that had something to do with the pressure that President Trump and you brought to bear on the situation? And is it time for the protesters to give up the ghost?
Well, listen, I think it is a positive step that they formally withdrawn the extradition bill. I think it's really a response to the people of Hong Kong, to the brave protesters. As you noted, just over a week ago, I was in Asia and went to Japan and Taiwan and India and Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, I sat down and met with leaders of the protest, met with democracy activists, and encouraged them that their actions, standing up for freedom, standing up for democracy, are really highlighting for the world. The eyes of the world are on Hong Kong, and withdrawing the extradition bill is a sign of the weakness and the fear that the Chinese Communist government has of the protesters and their demands for freedom.
Is it time for the protesters to stop?
Look, I think they're going to make that decision based on the ground, what's real. They're standing up for democracy. They're standing up for freedom, and they're standing up for China to follow its diplomatic treaty obligations. That when China reverted control over Hong Kong, it agreed to protect Hong Kong's autonomy. It agreed to protect their diplomatic rights, and we're seeing right now instead China trying to exert political oppression. And you know, to illustrate just how terrified the Xi government is of the Hong Kong protesters, you need look no further than the reaction in the NBA. A couple of weeks ago, as you know, Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, my hometown team, tweeted out a really benign tweet that said, "Stand for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And the government of China, the communist government, went nuts. They canceled the Houston Rockets TV contracts. They canceled their internet contracts. They canceled their supporters.
Right.
They canceled everything. And what then happened, the NBA began just groveling in apology, putting one profuse apology after the other. It was not the NBA's finest hour.
But the NBA has since, it seems, moved in a position that you might find more tenable and amenable, correct?
So I agree. They have gotten better, and I was pleased to see the commissioner after the first prostrations that they got better, and they actually spoke out in support of free speech. And listen, I'll say I retweeted today Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq, you want to talk about someone standing up and being a hero. Shaq had the courage on national television to rightly say Daryl Morey was right, and that in America, our values, we believe in free speech. I think Shaq's exactly right. I think he's demonstrating courage. And I think others in the NBA should follow. And by the way, while we're celebrating people who've shown courage, we also saw someone from Hollywood do that, which is Quentin Tarantino. Quentin Tarantino, with his movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the Chinese government wanted him to censor that movie, wanted him to edit out a portion of it, and Tarantino, to his credit, said no, he's not going to give in to censorship. Tarantino's exactly right, Shaq's exactly right, and we need to see more people demonstrate the courage that Shaq and Tarantino are demonstrating.
Have you talked to Adam Silver or Daryl Morey or the owner of the Rockets during this whole process?
So I haven't spoken with them directly. My team is talking with the NBA. I've announced that I intend to chair a hearing looking at Chinese censorship, and I don't think U.S. companies or U.S. global sports league should be dragooned into censoring Americans at the behest of the Chinese communists.
Why are you concerned about this now, Senator? I mean, the Chinese have been, not doing the right thing, I think you would characterize it, with regard to human rights for a long time.
Yeah.
Why are you so concerned at this point in time?
Well, look, China is, I believe, the most significant long-term geopolitical threat facing America. I mentioned the Asia tour that I was just on of Japan, Taiwan, India, Hong Kong. That was really designed to be a friends and allies tour. It was all of our close friends, or a number of our close friends, all surrounding China and dealing with China's enhanced military aggression. You know, China is modernizing its military. They're doing so in large part with technology, intellectual property they've stolen from the United States, because they employ the theft of IP as a policy agenda item. And that threat is very real. China's human rights record is abysmal. They torture their citizens, they murder their citizens. Roughly 1 million Uyghurs are held in concentration camps. And so I've long spoken out against Chinese human rights abuses. What we're seeing now, though, is a more dangerous incarnation, which is U.S. companies. They're so desperate to make a buck in China, and I get it. Look, it's a lot of money, access to the Chinese market, but we shouldn't have our fundamental values. Free speech shouldn't be for sale.
So what is the way forward, let's say, for Apple, which is a company that you've been critical of? I mean, you're suggesting that they can and should do business there, but it's a difficult path to navigate. So how do they do it?
Well, for example, Apple, we saw with regard to Hong Kong that they pulled down the Taiwanese flag from their app in Hong Kong. So you could get it here, you just couldn't get it in Hong Kong. They also pulled down a separate app that the protesters were using to help organize. I don't think U.S. companies should be willing to aid and abet oppression and censorship by the communist government.
But don't companies have different business practices in other countries, say in Saudi Arabia or places in Latin America, all the time?
Look, there are all sorts of cultural norms. The cultural norms are different from torture, murder, and oppression. Basic human rights, there's no cultural norms that justifies putting 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, that justifies persecuting the Falun Gong for expressing their faith and religious beliefs, for persecuting Tibet. And one of the ways that the Chinese Communist government seeks to enforce its repression is through censorship. And if American companies, if Hollywood is willing to be the vehicle of censorship. I'll give an example. The new Top Gun movie is coming out.
Right.
Top Gun, great movie. So the back of Maverick's jacket, they have apparently removed both the Japanese flag and the Taiwanese flag. They were both
Right.
on the back of Maverick's jacket. Why? Because the Chinese government didn't like it. That's terrible.
Yesterday, Bob Iger said, he was asked about China, and he said, I'm not going to comment because I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. Is that in itself capitulation?
Of course it is. And Top Gun was probably the greatest military recruiting film of all time. We now have Maverick acting scared of the Chinese communists. That's just messed up. And so Hollywood, look, Quentin Tarantino showed you can actually demonstrate you've got a backbone and stand up for free speech. That ought to be something Hollywood's able to do. And I'm all for business pursuing opportunities, but not at the expense of free speech and our fundamental values.
All right, a lot to chew on there. Senator Cruz, thanks so much for your time.